A dialect, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is a form of a language that people speak in a particular part of a country, containing some different words and grammar, etc. Every language has different dialects. In Canada, there are 10 provinces and 3 territories. Since there are many regions, that means there are different cultures, which leads to the modification of English over the years. We're going to look at 7 prevalent Canadian English dialects. Let's start with Aboriginal Canadian English. First of all, it is important to know that Aboriginal is another word used to talk about Indigenous peoples, which refers to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. These people were already living in Canada when Jacques Cartier planted his cross in the name of King of France in 1534 in Gaspé. This is the symbol that Canada was possessed by the Europeans. According to the article Indigenous Languages in Canada by Karen Rice, there are around 60 distinct Indigenous languages in Canada, falling into 10 separate language families. 2 of the best-known family languages are Algonquin and Iroquoian. Cree and Anishinaabe Ojibwe are 2 languages that are part of the Algonquin family, and they are mainly spoken in central and eastern Canada. Indigenous dialects are really complicated because there are many varieties. For instance, still according to the Canadian Encyclopedia's article mentioned above, Cree is considered to be a single language with 8 or more variants, spoken in dozens of communities and reserves from the Rockies well into Quebec and Labrador. And Anishinaabe Ojibwe, with a number of dialect variants, is found in many communities throughout central Canada. Despite the diversity of Indigenous languages, many of these are endangered. The reason is that during the conquest of Canada, there were several restrictive laws for Aboriginal peoples. For example, there was, as we can read in the Canadian Encyclopedia's article by William B. Anderson, the Indian Act is the principal statute through which the federal government administers Indian status, local First Nations, governments, and the management of reserve land and communal monies. Also, G.R. Miller wrote an article in the Canadian Encyclopedia in which we can read that residential schools were government-sponsored religious schools established to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture. In these schools, Indigenous peoples were forced to abandon their native languages, otherwise they were punished. In the article Indigenous Languages in Canada, it says that the 2011 Statistics Canada census report estimated that only Cree, Ojibwe, and the Inuit languages have sufficient numbers to continue to be spoken well into the future. To go back to the Aboriginal Canadian English, this dialect is mainly spoken throughout the north of Canada, which is composed of the Northwest Territories, the Nunavut, and the Yukon provinces. Let's continue with another English dialect in Canada, Cape Breton English. Cape Breton Island is at the eastern end of the Canadian province of Nova Scotia. The island has its own dialect due to its isolation. People who live there are descendants of Highland Scottish, Irish, and French Acadian. The third dialect is Lunenburg English, which is spoken in the province of Nova Scotia. This dialect is heavily influenced by German, as we can see with people's tendency of pronouncing V instead of W. Also, people tend to pronounce the TH sound like D or T. For instance, they would say, the kids were over there in the woods getting in that, this, and that. Newfoundland English is another dialect spoken in the Newfoundland and Labrador province and the Prince Edward Island. Before obtaining its independence in 1907, Newfoundland was a British colony, which influenced their English. Here are some expressions you are more likely to hear if you go there. Do you want some taken up? Which means, want some supper? What odds? Which means, who cares? I'll drop over round by and by, which means, I'll visit sometime. Let's continue with the Ottawa Valley dialect, which is a Canadian English spoken in the Ottawa Valley. This dialect has been influenced by Scottish, Irish, and American loyalists. An interesting fact about this dialect is that instead of saying, he went to the store to buy a tie, people usually say, he went to the store for to buy a tie. In British Columbia and Yukon provinces, the spoken dialect is Pacific Northwest English, also known as Pacific West Coast English. One particularity is that the word stick is pronounced like steak. Quebec is the only province that has French as the official language. Despite this, a lot of people speak English, and this is why there's a Quebec English dialect. In this French-speaking province, some people mixed up the two languages in their sentences, and this is called Franglish, or Franglais, as would French speakers say. Here's a Franglais sentence that is used by French Quebecers. Trouver un parking. Parking is actually an English word, but it is still used in French sentences. Even if the word stationnement exists, Quebecers often use the English word. One of the Franglish sentences is, take a decision. You might be wondering why this is considered a Franglish sentence, since decision is a word that you can find in an English dictionary. In fact, it is an English word, but it is an English word that is of French origin. Last but not least, the inland Canadian English, also called Canadian English. This dialect is spoken throughout Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan provinces. It is similar to the American English, mixed with some British influences.